Hey guys, great to see you again. We've got a really cool and thought-provoking subject to cover today. Before we jump in, make yourself comfortable. A quick like and subscribe would mean the world to us, and tell us down below, what time are you watching and from which part of the world? We hope you enjoy the video. Imagine waking up in a small wooden boat no wider than a city bus. The sky is dark and the chill of the early morning air seeps into your bones. The waves are relentless, crashing against the sides and rocking the vessel with constant motion. There is no comfort here, no cozy bed, no warmth from a fire. This is life aboard a Viking ship, and if you think you would last a day, think again. The first thing that strikes you is the overwhelming exposure. Viking ships were open to the elements, made mostly of planks hand-fitted with care, but offering no shelter beyond what your rudimentary clothes could provide. Rain, wind and salt spray attacked from every angle. The sun beat down relentlessly in summer, and the cold through winter days could freeze flesh and bones without mercy. The ocean air, soaked in salt and sweat, was never shy. There was no dry space to retreat to. The planks beneath your feet were rough and uneven. You would spend hours standing or crouching on them as the ship pitched and rolled with the waves. Balance became a constant struggle. Every step required intense focus to avoid stumbling and falling overboard. If you had ever imagined the life of a Viking as one of bold adventure and thrilling battles from a distance, the reality was far harsher. It was one of endurance, grit, and no small amount of suffering. Hygiene was virtually non-existent. The ocean might as well have been the crew's only bathing opportunity, but between the cold temperature and the choppy waves, few bothered to clean themselves regularly. The smell of sweat mixed with the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting fish, and seaweed filled the air. Fleas and lice were constant companions, thriving in the cramped sleeping quarters where dozens of men huddled together for warmth and shared what little space the ship afforded. The conditions created a perfect breeding ground for illness and infection. Food was a precious commodity, but often less than desirable. Vikings relied on preserved provisions such as dried fish, salted meat, hard bread called hardtack, and occasionally dried berries or nuts. Fresh food was rare and often consisted of whatever could be caught that day. The same meals repeated over days and weeks took their toll on morale. Despite the hardships, every sailor knew the importance of conserving energy and strength. You had to eat what was given, lest weakness invite disaster in the form of rough seas or enemy attacks. Water posed an even greater challenge. Freshwater supplies were limited. Barrels of rainwater collected before the voyage were precious and rationed carefully. Thirst was a constant concern. Drinking salt water was deadly, yet when the water ran low, some sailors faced the agonizing choice of risking dehydration or searching desperately for land or rain. The lack of hydration weakened bodies and minds, leading to fatigue and confusion in situations where sharp senses and quick decisions could mean the difference between life and death. The noise on board was relentless. Waves crashing, wood creaking, men shuffling and speaking in guttural tones. The rhythm of rowing filled the air with its unyielding beat during moments when sails could not be used or the wind was against them. Sleep was a luxury few knew. Beds did not exist. Instead, sailors slept curled on the wooden floors, exposed and vulnerable. Their rest was light and interrupted, ensuring that everyone remained alert for sudden threats. Nights were pitch black, save for the occasional flicker of a lantern or stars dimmed by the fog rolling in off the ocean. In addition to nature's assaults, danger lurked in every corner. Viking voyages were often about more than just travel. Encounters with rival clans, hostile tribes, or well-armed defenders were expected. Fighting in such confined quarters tested not only strength but the ability to keep calm amid chaos. The ship's narrow confines allowed no space to retreat. Wounds were common, and medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. The slightest injury could become infected and spiral into something far worse without proper care. The crew itself was a microcosm of Viking society, forged by a shared purpose, but tested by unrelenting hardship. There was no room for weakness. Physical fitness and mental fortitude were requirements. Arguments flared, tempers snapped. Yet cooperation was non-negotiable. Every man depended on the other to hold his post, row in unison, manage the sails, and stand guard through the perilous nights. There was no single captain barking orders from a throne. Instead, leadership was earned through respect, skill, and experience. Those chosen to guide the vessel bore heavy responsibility for every soul under their command. Endurance was the silent rule. The grueling voyages often lasted weeks or months, sailing across unpredictable seas, facing storms that could tear ships apart or strand them on unfamiliar shores. Survival was never guaranteed, and yet, driven by ambition, necessity, or sheer stubbornness, Viking sailors pressed onward. The promise of new lands, riches from raids, or simply the hope of returning home kept them moving through the relentless hardships. By the time daylight approached on any given day, exhaustion would have taken its toll. Bodies bruised from constant labor, minds numb from the ceaseless demand for vigilance. The waves would continue to surge, the wind to howl, and the monotonous grind of life aboard the ship to press relentlessly forward. For anyone unprepared for such an existence, a single day would be unbearable. But in truth, it was not one day for Vikings. It was a way of life carved into their very souls. Living on a Viking ship was the harshest reality imaginable for most people today. Far from the heroic imagery of shining shields and roaring battles, the true story is of enduring raw elements, relentless physical toil, sparse and often unpleasant food and water, limited hygiene, close quarters breeding sickness and strife, and constant threat of death by nature or foe. Surviving a single day under such conditions required more than courage. It required a body toughened by years of hardship, a mind sharpened by necessity, and a spirit unyielding to despair. The next time you watch tales of Viking voyages on screen or hear stories of their legendary raids, remember the unseen cost of such adventures. The cold that gnaws at your skin, the stench that refuses to leave your clothes, the ceaseless roar of the sea like a living enemy. Imagine standing in the place of those sailors before dawn rises, wondering if your strength and will could truly meet what awaits you. In the unforgiving world of the Viking ship, you wouldn't last a day. The Viking ship was an incredible feat of engineering for its time. It was slender, quick, and surprisingly resilient against the vast and often unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic and beyond. Yet this marvel of craft and design concealed an unforgiving and brutal reality for those who called it home during raids or long voyages. Life aboard one of these ships was a daily battle, where comfort was absent and the harsh environment tested every fiber of a person's being. To truly understand why you would not last a day on a Viking ship, it helps to delve deeper into the conditions, routines, and challenges faced by its crew. To begin with, space was unimaginably cramped. Viking ships were long and narrow, built for speed and mobility rather than comfort. Although they could hold about 30 to 60 men depending on the ship's size, their tight quarters allowed very little room for personal belongings or privacy. Imagine resting your head only a few feet from dozens of other warriors, your sleeping space no wider than a single plank of wood. There was no sanctuary, no cabin where one could escape the close quarters or find shelter from the elements. Everyone shared the same wooden floorboards, which became soaked and slippery in bad weather, making rest an uneasy option. The ship's low freeboard meant that waves often crashed over the sides, drenching everything again and again. The exposure to the elements was relentless. Wind, rain, and cold air made themselves known every day and night. There was no insulation on these ships. Coats or cloaks helped, but during storms the cold seeped into bones and prolonged wetness sapped both morale and strength. The salt spray stung skin and eyes, Sleep became a matter of moments stolen when the sea was calm, followed by hours of vigilance. On longer journeys, frostbite and hypothermia lurked as deadly possibilities. Even in summer, the chill coming off the ocean could leave hands numb or teeth chattering. Food was another harsh reality. Unlike the salt-laden provisions carried on some vessels, Vikings relied heavily on salted meats, dried fish, hard biscuits known as ship's bread, or whatever fresh game they could catch. Fresh water was stored in containers that could only hold so much, so rationing was strict. Meals were often cold and quickly eaten. Hunger, thirst, and the threat of scurvy left no room for indulgence. The sailors' bodies grew tired and thin from the limited diet combined with relentless physical labour. That labour was constant and exhausting. The Viking ships depended on both wind and human muscle. When the wind was favourable, sails filled with the fresh sea air, but when it died down or during intricate manoeuvres, rowers powered the ship forward with oars. These sessions were punishing. Rowing required intense, synchronized effort, demanding every ounce of strength the men had. The long, grueling pulls strained muscles and sapped energy reserves. There was no relief or breaks that lasted long, for the sea never ceased its pressures. Beyond the physical hardships, the psychological pressures were immense. The Viking world was violent and uncertain. Every journey held the possibility of combat or capture, yet retreat was not an option for fear of dishonor. Preparation for battle meant constant readiness. Weapons and shields were never far. The cacophony of waves, creaking wood, and shouted orders created a soundtrack that never faded. Many men lost hours of sleep from the tension alone, alert for threats that could spring from water or distant shores. Hygiene was almost non-existent. Days or weeks could pass without fresh water for washing. Salt and grime-coated skin. Clothes remained damp and soiled. Disease found fertile ground in these conditions. Illness spread quickly when confined to such narrow spaces. Injuries, whether from combat or ship accidents, could become dangerous due to infection. Healing was slow and medical knowledge limited. Pain and sickness added to the daily misery. Ventilation was poor but vital. The Viking ship had a tent or canopy covering part of the deck for shelter. Underneath, the air turned thick with the smell of sweat, smoke from small cooking fires, and the stench of human waste. Latrines were simple and far from private, often requiring a balance between necessity and danger while at sea. The unrelenting closeness to others amplified tensions. Arguments and disputes arose over minor matters, creating another layer of stress. The constant noise was taxing. The sound of waves crashing, the wind's howl, the strain of ropes and sails, the pounding rowing rhythm, and the voices calling orders and warnings formed an unending din. Sleep was often broken or shallow. This noise, combined with the harsh sway of the vessel, amplified seasickness. Many Viking sailors suffered debilitating nausea that left them weak during critical tasks. The fine line between strength and collapse was a daily struggle. Daily tasks extended beyond navigation and rowing. Maintenance of the ship was unending. Salt and water rapidly wore down wood and metal fittings. Crew members had to patch sails, tighten ropes, and ensure the hull remained free from leaks. These chores needed to be done whatever the weather or time of day. Worn or broken equipment jeopardized the safety of the entire crew and ship. Negligence was not an option. The social hierarchy aboard was rigid but dependent on cooperation. Chieftains or captains exercised authority, expecting obedience without question. Discipline was enforced by harsh measures if necessary. Insults or insubordination were dangerous. Yet, on this tight vessel, the survival of all depended on teamwork. Friendships, alliances, and sometimes rivalries shaped the dynamic. Underneath the brutal surface was a fragile balance between order and chaos. The need for navigation added another layer of stress. Viking sailors used a blend of coastal landmarks, star positions, the sun, sea currents, and the behavior of birds to chart a course. Storm clouds or fog meant the loss of these cues and the potential to drift far off dangerous paths. The unknown sea was an enormous force that demanded vigilance and deep knowledge, but could still surprise even the most experienced sailors. One cannot forget the seasonal nature of many Viking expeditions. They often set sail in spring or early summer, aiming to reach distant lands before harsh winters made travel impossible. This meant that fast, efficient progress was essential. Loitering or delays meant returning in winter storms or being trapped in unfamiliar and hostile lands, exposed to freezing cold and starvation. Every decision carried significant risk. An unending rhythm drove daily life. Wake, eat quickly, row or manage sails, work on repairs, keep watch, prepare weapons, rest briefly, then repeat. The men lived a harsh and raw existence wrapped in salt, steel, wood, and the ever-changing face of the sea. It was a relentless grind towards survival and achievement, but few lived to tell of long voyages without being worn down nearly to their breaking points. If you imagine yourself stepping onto that narrow deck with seawater slapping against your knees and wind tearing at your clothes, you begin to understand what it truly means to live as a Viking sailor. Your breath would return damp and hollow, your fingers stiff from cold, your stomach gnawing with hunger, your muscles aching from unending effort, your mind sharp yet fatigued from focus and fear, your sleep a broken thread held together in snatches. This was no leisurely adventure, it was raw human endurance pushed to extremes. The Viking ship was a vessel of war, exploration and survival, but it demanded a resilience that few could withstand. The physical and mental demands converged in a crucible of discomfort and danger. No modern convenience softened these blows. The tools and technology improved navigation and protection, yet they did not eliminate these brutal realities. In essence, the Viking ship was a bold statement of human capability, but also a harsh reminder of nature's dominance. To last a day aboard was to endure constant challenge and discomfort, requiring toughness forged by culture and circumstance. To last longer required a rare combination of strength, courage, and stoicism in the face of relentless adversity. Understanding this goes beyond romantic visions of glorious raids or heroic sagas. It reveals the gritty, unvarnished life that grounded Viking power and success. Here, amid wind and waves, you glimpse a harsher truth, a life that demanded sacrifice and endurance not easily matched. In the next section, we will explore the extraordinary skills Viking sailors developed to master this environment and push beyond these limitations. We will discover how knowledge, technique, and adaptation allowed them to turn such a brutal existence into a pathway of exploration and conquest. But for now, it is important to recognize the raw reality. Stepping foot on a Viking ship was stepping into a world where only the toughest could survive even a single day. The biting cold of the North Sea is relentless. Each gust of wind slaps against the skin like a whip. On a Viking ship, the chill penetrated every layer of clothing, reaching even to the bones of those aboard. The longships were marvels of their time, sleek and swift, but they were incredibly exposed. There was no shelter to speak of. Crew members were drenched by freezing spray from the waves as the prow cut through the dark, roiling water. The deck was a constant slick sloshed over by the unceasing motion of the ocean. Imagine standing there, your clothes soaked through, boots filled with icy water, fingers and toes numb from the cold. Every breath you exhale is a misty cloud, proof that you are alive but struggling just to hold on to warmth. This was the everyday reality for Vikings on their voyages. Their iron and wood vessels bore them across seas that would humble even the strongest sailors today. The endurance needed was immense, far beyond what most could manage. The labour was unending. The oarsmen rowed for hours, sometimes days, only pausing when the wind was strong enough to fill the sail. This was back-breaking work. Arms burned from the repetitive motion, muscles trembling under the strain. Every man was expected to pull his weight because the speed and stability of the ship depended on the crew's synchronized effort. Any lapse could mean disaster on those unpredictable waters. Food and water were precious commodities. Before setting out, the ship's stores were limited to dried meats, hard biscuits, and salted fish. Fresh food was a rarity. The crew often survived on just what they loaded before the voyage and whatever they could catch along the way, like fish from the sea. Fresh water was strictly rationed. Imagine being parched but unable to drink more because the limited supply must last. This rationing was vital since the ships carried no means to collect fresh water during the journey. Sleep was scarce and fragmented. There were no hammocks or designated bunks. Instead, men rested where they could, often sitting or lying on the cold wooden deck surrounded by the constant noise of wind and waves. Sleeping near shifting gear and heavy weapons added to the hazard. A sudden wave could pitch the ship violently, throwing a man against the wood or overboard. The risk of injury was ever present. Those who fell asleep on watch risked the entire crew. Vigilance was a necessity. Hygiene was almost non-existent. Days or weeks at sea meant no bathing except for rare and dangerous immersions into the icy ocean. Disease and infection spread rapidly in these cramped quarters. The salty sea air did little to mask the smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the inevitable refuse. Fleas and lice were common companions. Their bites added to the misery, causing itching and distraction from the physical demands of the voyage. Mental strain weighed heavily. The isolation exposed the raw edges of human nature. Fear of storms, the unknown, and enemy attacks kept tension high. Yet camaraderie was also forged in this claustrophobic, brutal environment. Without strong bonds, many would have cracked under the strain. Discipline was harsh but necessary. A single weak link could jeopardize the entire ship and its mission. Navigation itself was an art born of keen intuition and profound experience. The Vikings relied on the sun, stars, and coastal landmarks to guide their way. On overcast days or during storms, they employed rudimentary methods such as observing the color of the waves and the behavior of seabirds. The wooden sunstone, a type of crystal, is believed to have helped locate the sun's position under cloudy skies. Despite their skills, going astray was a real danger. Becoming lost in the vast emptiness of the ocean could be fatal. Storms were the ultimate test. Fierce winds and towering waves slammed against the fragile ship. The hull groaned under the pressure, water flooded the deck, and the mast bent perilously. Every man was called to battle with the elements. The sail was taken down or reefed to reduce strain. Oarsmen fought to keep the ship facing the waves, preventing capsizing. Many vessels and crew never survived such tempests. Death by drowning was a constant threat. The cold did not relent even after the storm passed. Those who made it through found themselves battered and exhausted, but still exposed to the elements. Their bodies ached, their spirits dampened by the relentless harshness. The notion of comfort was so foreign that sailors adjusted to suffering as normal. The longships were not floating homes. They were instruments of war, trade, and exploration designed for speed and efficiency at the cost of personal ease. Shipboard life meant living in constant proximity to weapons. Axes, spears, and swords lined the walls, always within reach. Every man was a warrior as well as a sailor. Battles could erupt without warning, requiring immediate readiness to fight. The noise during such moments was deafening. The clash of steel shouted commands, and cries of pain filled the air. Returning to this after hours of exhausting rowing tested a man's resilience in every way. Fresh water was collected at stops whenever possible, but such reprieves were rare and brief. The ships often anchored in hostile or unfamiliar lands, shadowed by the threat of attack. The Viking expeditions were fueled by ambition, but grounded in harsh survival realities. The ocean was not only a route for raids and trade, but also a relentless crucible that tested every sailor's mettle beyond what most could endure. illness, and injury were common aboard because of these conditions. Minor wounds often festered and became life-threatening without proper care. Belligerent or careless sailors could damage the tight structure of the ship or endanger the entire crew through mistakes. The captain's authority was absolute. Discipline was enforced to maintain order and survival. Sleep deprivation, starvation, exposure, and the constant threat of violence created a recipe for mental breakdown. Yet stories of endurance and survival show how these men coped with the unbearable stresses. Some created rituals or routines to maintain a sense of control. Others found solace in song or shared stories of home. Still, the savage existence aboard a Viking ship was utterly unforgiving. To last one day under those conditions was a trial. Each hour you would fight off hypothermia, keep your limbs moving to stave off numbness, work as hard as your body allowed, and hold your mind steady amid chaos. Few within the modern world, accustomed to comfort, safety, and predictability, could endure even this short span. The Viking ship was a stage upon which the rawest human struggles unfolded continuously. And even if you survived the day, the relentless journey stretched onward. This was not a battle fought and won quickly. It was an ordeal by water and weather that could last for weeks. Only those hardened by birth and training endured. To step aboard was to abandon almost everything known and comfortable. It demanded the courage and toughness of legends. The question is not merely who could last a day. It is who could grasp what it meant to stand resolute against the elements, against exhaustion, hunger, isolation, and fear all at once. To endure on a Viking ship was to embrace the edge of human endurance and confront the indifferent wrath of nature itself without faltering. No matter how sophisticated our technology or soft our modern lives, the Viking ship reminds us of a raw, rugged reality. A world where survival was never guaranteed, where every breath was a victory, where man tested his limits against the sea and sky. It stood as a vessel not just of wood, but of sheer will. To claim the sea in that age demanded a ferocity and resilience that few could summon. One glance at the creaking timbers beneath your feet, one taste of salt on the cold wind, 1 hour spent in this unforgiving harshness would dispel illusions of adventure gilded by tales and trophies. The Viking ship was a crucible of danger and hardship so intense that to last a day was itself an extraordinary feat. The legacy of these ships, their raids, and their seafarers echoes down history. But it also serves as a harsh reminder. Civilization's comforts are a fragile veneer. Beneath it lies the primal struggle for survival that the Vikings lived and breathed every moment of their voyages. To truly grasp why you would not last a day on a Viking ship is to glimpse the raw human spirit at its fiercest and most vulnerable. As months-long expeditions delivered the Vikings to unknown lands, they did so with every bone taxed and every nerve stretched taut. Their ships sliced through history and memory alike, propelled by muscle, sweat, and an unyielding will. And so we return to the question that echoes through the ages. How could you endure what they endured? How could you hold fast when the only certainty was the next wave or the next breath? The answer lies locked in the hard texture of those ships and the men they carried. The men who would not break, but who knew every day was a fight simply to remain alive. And what does this mean for us now? It means honoring the raw grit hidden beneath legendary sagas. It means understanding that beneath every epic lie struggles sheer human endurance, sacrifice, and courage. So as the Viking ship continues to captivate imaginations, remember the weight of harsh reality tethered to every oar stroke, every splinter of cold oak, every blistered palm. It was a world utterly unfriendly to weakness, yet commanded by the fiercely resilient. This is why you would not last a day on a Viking ship. Because it is not merely a vessel of exploration or conquest. It is a relentless trial by sea and storm and man against nature at her most unforgiving. To sail on it was to confront a reality stripped bare, to meet discomfort and danger as your constant companions. To stand aboard that ship was to become part of a saga written in sweat, salt, and steel. The story does not soften with time. The passage of centuries does not dilute the harshness. It only sharpens our wonder at what it took to survive and thrive in such a world. Each voyage was a testament to tenacity, skill, and above all, the iron endurance demanded by the untamed elements. And amid that brutal truth, we find the enduring power of the Viking spirit, a legacy far more than raiding and battle. It is the legacy of unwavering endurance on the sea's treacherous stage. Day after day, storm after storm, the Viking ship carried men who cast themselves into the abyss and returned to tell the tale. Their journey was never easy, not even for a single day. For them, the sea was both highway and battlefield, home and adversary. They endured unimaginable hardship to leave their mark on the world. To walk in their footsteps requires more than imagination. It demands respect for the fierce realities faced on those long, wild voyages, and the knowledge that to last even a short time aboard a Viking ship was a triumph against overwhelming odds. The sea, the cold, the hunger, the ceaseless labor, and relentless danger are all reminders that this was no place for the faint of heart. It was a place where ordinary men became legends through sheer determination and the force of their will. To stand on the deck just once would forever change any sense of what endurance truly means. And yet the legend calls across the centuries. That call is not an invitation to romantic adventure, but a summons to recognize the sheer power of survival under the most extreme conditions. To the Viking ship, every day was a battle, every moment a test of human limits. The story of those ships remains not only a saga of conquest, but a monumental lesson in what it means to endure beyond all odds. So as we look back, the ghostly outlines of the ships cutting through the misty waves beckon us toward a deeper understanding. To endure on a Viking ship was to step into an elemental struggle with the forces of nature and the limits of human strength. It was to wage war against the cold, the storm, the hunger, and exhaustion. It was to face every moment with a fierce determination that many today cannot truly imagine. In this harsh world forged by wind and tide, the Viking ship was not just a vessel. It was a crucible of survival that demanded everything from every man who dared to sail her into the unknown. It was a place where comfort was an enemy and endurance the only currency. To last a day was itself a victory. To last a lifetime was to become legend. And that is why you would not last a day on a Viking ship. The relentless moisture of the ocean clings to everything on a Viking ship. It seeps into the wooden planks beneath your feet and turns the air into a thick, damp cloak that never lifts. The ship's single sail, made of linen and treated with animal fat to repel water, is rarely dry. Constant rain and sea spray dress the vessel in a slick sheen that runs cold through every fiber of the crew's clothing. You might think that life on such a ship is just about the adventure of the open sea or the lure of distant shores, but the truth is far harsher. The physical environment aboard a Viking longship was one of the most punishing aspects that would break even the strongest souls. The cold bites through any layer of clothing that you manage to wear. Storms blow in with terrifying suddenness. When the waves grow monstrous and the wind howls like a banshee, the wooden ship creaks and groans as if it were alive and struggling against the fury of nature itself. The constant need to be on alert makes rest nearly impossible. Once you subtract the glamorized Viking warrior image, what remains is a reality of constant exposure. Your skin raw from salt and wind, your muscles cramped from gripping oars for hours without relief, each day blending into the next as you sit shoulder to shoulder with comrades who are equally drained but no less vigilant. Hygiene on these vessels was nearly non-existent. Water was too precious to waste on washing. Fresh water was carried in barrels, but it could sour and run out quickly. The crew survived mostly on salted and dried fish or meat, hardtack, and occasional fresh fruit or vegetables when available. For a person accustomed to a more modern regimen, these dietary limitations would cause rapid physical decline and worsen morale. Illness and injury on board rarely received more than bare-bones attention. There were no doctors, only men who might have dabbled in herb lore or rudimentary first aid. Wounds caused by accidents or battle could become deadly. Infection was rampant in such confined quarters with no real knowledge of germs or sterilization. Even routine aches from rowing and constant exposure could turn to something far worse without proper rest or care. There lies beneath the romantic image of Viking ships a brutal reality, one of suffering and endurance that was necessary just to survive from one day to the next. The structure of the longship itself also contributed to the challenge. Despite its sleek and famously agile design, it was narrow and low. The ship measured overall about 20 meters or more depending on the type and had a shallow draft to enable beach landings and river navigation. Because of this, there was no real shelter. The crew sat exposed on planks that formed the benches for rowing. At times, when oars were not in use, bodies packed closely would have made movement difficult. Above, the sail rigging and flags whipped in the wind, giving little protection from the elements. Occasionally, a small canopy or tarp might cover part of the deck, but these were flimsy at best against harsh weather. Below decks, there was no cabin or proper living space. Any cargo, such as trade goods or spoils, would be stowed there, but barely room for sleeping or rest. The rowing itself was brutal labour. Each longship had between 20 and 60 oars depending on size. The rowers sat on benches facing outward, pulling in coordination to propel the ship. This method offered speed and agility, but only at the expense of exhausting every individual's strength. Days of continuous rowing, especially under harsh weather, could wear out the body to the point of collapse. Failure to keep pace could mean death if the ship was fleeing enemies or struggling toward shelter before a storm. The rhythm of the rowing was dictated by a drummer or a ship's leader shouting commands to maintain order and timing. Hearing commands cut through the wind and waves was vital, but rarely gentle. Those who could not keep up risked punishment or exclusion from the crew. The absence of any privacy only added to the emotional strain. Viking crews were tight-knit, but inwardly tensions simmered under the strain of hardened discipline and shared hardship. Disputes could erupt quickly in cramped spaces with limited means to diffuse anger or frustration. The hierarchy on board was clear, but had to be enforced constantly. Disobedience or perceived weakness threatened the survival of every member. Despite camaraderie that formed from shared battle and voyage, the environment was unforgiving and left little room for rest. Sleep was stolen on wood or tightly packed straw mats if luck allowed. The continual noises of rocking water against the ship's sides, the cracking and creaking of timbers, the shouting commands and weather's assault made deep rest nearly impossible. Despite its deadly challenges, the Viking longship was also a marvel of engineering, built to meet these exact conditions. The keel was flexible yet strong, allowing the ship to ride over waves instead of breaking through them, which would cause damage. The hull was clinker-built, meaning overlapping planks were riveted together, creating a light but sturdy frame. This design innovation was key to the ship's speed and durability. Even so, it did not protect the crew from cold-driven exhaustion, seasickness, or the ever-present threat of capsizing in storms. Seasickness was one of many afflictions that would immediately debilitate a person unaccustomed to life at sea. Many Vikings grew up near the water, accustomed from childhood to the motions of boats and waves. For those not born to such conditions or untrained, the constant rocking of the ship caused nausea and vomiting, leaving the body weak and dehydrated. On long voyages, millions suffered silently without relief. No medicine or treatment existed other than grit and endurance. Those who failed to acclimate quickly likely fell behind or were cast ashore by necessity. Survival aboard required mental toughness rivaling the physical demands of the journey. Simple boredom could feel suffocating. endless hours each day of rowing or standing watch with nothing to do but listen to wind and water takes a toll on the mind. The psychological isolation combined with physical exhaustion tested the limits of any man. The knowledge that you floated on a fragile plank of wood amid an endless ocean where one mistake could sink the entire ship leaves little room for comfort or complacency. Food scarcity during longer sea journeys added another dimension to these hardships. Fresh water and food ran out quickly, especially when storms delayed travel or forced detours far from known harbours. The Viking diet on ship normally consisted of preserved foods containing minimal nutrients necessary for survival, leading to deficiencies like scurvy. The lack of vitamin-rich sources caused swollen gums, lethargy, and in advanced stages, death. With no farmers or markets accessible at sea, the crew depended on rains, collected seabirds, or fishing when possible. This was risky and unreliable. Hunger and malnutrition further weakened the crew's capacity to endure the next day. The threat of enemies, in addition to environmental dangers, compounded these difficulties. Viking longships might be ambushed by rival clans, coastal defenders, or other seafarers. Combat on such a confined and precarious platform was terrifying and brutal. Swinging axes, spears, and shields collided amid the rocking deck amid splintering wood and flying spray. The loud cacophony of battle, combined with raging seas, created chaos where a single misstep could send a man overboard to drown or be lost forever. Each raid or battle demanded total focus and physical prowess from every individual. Failure or injury meant instant danger, not just to yourself, but to your entire community. Understanding the role of the Viking longship also requires appreciating the community it supported. This was not just a vessel for transport, but a mobile base from which entire raids and voyages launched. The durability and speed of the ship made it a weapon and a home, but one that pushed human endurance to its limits. Few would have lasted a full day without becoming broken in some combination of body, mind, or spirit. The expectation was clear. Survival required toughness born of harsh upbringing and unyielding will. To live among these conditions as a Viking crew member meant embracing constant discomfort. Your body tethered to the ship by effort and discipline. Your senses bombarded by salt, cold, and noise. Your health compromised by insufficient nutrition and hygiene. Your sleep fragmented and your emotions stretched thin. And yet an entire culture thrived within these constraints. The ships were not just transportation, but symbols of their identity, ambition, and connection to the sea itself. In the end, the myth of the Viking ship is inseparable from the harsh reality endured by those who sailed it. While tales celebrate monstrous raids and legendary voyages, the day-to-day existence was far from heroic luxury. The ship was both cradle and crucible, a test of strength, endurance, and spirit. Those who mastered its challenges earned a place in saga and history, while innumerable others were forgotten by time. If you imagine stepping aboard a Viking longship today, you might dream of the thrill of open water, the sweep of wind in your hair, and the roar of battle cries. But the truth that meets you first is cold-soaked timber, blistered hands from endless rowing, the sharp taste of salt on your lips, and a bone-deep weariness staring down over endless waves. The sea is indifferent and endless. The ship is tiny and fragile in comparison. To last a day on a Viking ship was to confront those brutal truths from dawn to twilight without faltering. And that is why most people would not last even a single day in such relentless, unforgiving conditions. The wind howled through the open expanse of the North Atlantic. The sky was a flat grey, heavy with the threat of rain. The Viking ship cut through choppy waters, each splash of the icy sea spraying assault against exposed skin. The men aboard strained to keep the vessel on course. Their muscles ached with the endless task of rowing, their hands raw and blistered beneath the coarse hemp ropes. They were far from the comforts of home, caught in a relentless battle with nature and time. On a Viking ship, there was no room for weakness. From the moment the crew set foot on the wooden planks, survival demanded total commitment. Viking ships were marvels of engineering but unforgiving environments. Lightweight and shallow, these vessels allowed swift movement through coastal waters and narrow rivers. Their slender, elongated shape gave speed and agility, but sacrificed stability. A wave could send a man sprawling or worse. There was no shelter beyond the small, open-deck space. Exposure to the elements was absolute. Before the day dawned fully and long after the sun had slipped below the horizon, the crew's backs were bent beneath the weight of the journey. Their living quarters were non-existent. When rest came, it was often on cold, wet deckboards or crammed beneath a makeshift canopy of sailcloth and furs that offered little protection against wind and rain. Privacy was unheard of. The cramped conditions bred discomfort, but also an ever-present unity tempered by tension and raw survival instincts. The threat was not just the sea or weather storms, but the ever-looming presence of hunger and thirst. Vikings sustained themselves on salted meats, hardtack bread, dried fish, and whatever could be scavenged or caught. Water was rationed carefully. The crew gambled against dehydration and scurvy, their bodies slowly breaking down from lack of fresh food. The sting of salt water on cracked lips and the thirst that no amount of slave-worked water could quench made time drag like a cruel tormentor. Disease was a silent killer. Close quarters and poor sanitation ensured that sickness spread fast. The ship's deck was stained with blood and sweat, and worse. Foul odours clung impossibly to the sails and ropes. There was no doctor to turn to, no proper nursing for injuries. A simple wound could become infected, sealing a man's fate long before the enemy's blade ever found him. The Vikings prided themselves on toughness, but nature had no mercy. The physical toll was matched by mental fatigue. The monotonous rhythm of the waves, the endless sky, and the constant demands of sails and oars wore down mind and spirit. A Viking on a ship faced isolation in the crowd. There was no escape from the sound of creaking timbers or the cold that bit deep into bone. Time became 7 days of the same frozen, bouncing horizon with no respite. The familiarity bred an unspoken dread of what tomorrow might bring. Social order on board was strict but fragile. The captain's word was law. Discipline was crucial, but unrest never fully disappeared. Fatigue led to frayed tempers and brawls, sometimes fatal. Any sign of weakness or dissent was met with swift and often brutal punishment. The code of loyalty was unquestioned, but human nature was unpredictable when each soul wrestled with hunger, cold, and fear. Sleep came in scarce, dangerous snippets. At any moment the ship might be attacked or caught in a storm. One's dreams were constantly broken by the chill of near drowning, by the sudden cry of lookout, by the endless roll of waves threatening to drag man and mast into the dark below. Rest was a prize fought for and rarely won. Bodies heaved quietly in the dark, muscles twitching against the strain of continuous vigil. The ship itself was a character in this grim drama. The wood was soaked and swollen from unending exposure. Salt crystals encrusted every surface. The sails, once crisp and white, were now tattered and grey. Knots loosened under the relentless assault of wind and water. The delicate balance of mast and oar and sail demanded constant care. Neglect meant disaster. Every man was a caretaker, every task critical. The crack of splintering timber or the snap of a broken oar could doom the whole crew. Storms were the greatest ordeal. The sky would darken, the wind scream like an avenging spirit, and the sea rise in monstrous waves towering above the slender ship. The vessel tipped precariously. Men clung like barnacles to slippery rails and rigging. Amid screams and shouts, some were lost overboard, swallowed by the sea's frothing mouth in an instant. The weight of salt water threatened to break hull and spirit alike. No promises of rescue existed beyond the endurance of body and will. If the seas did not kill them, the cold would. Without modern insulation or protective gear, the frigid air pierced to the core. Hands and feet lost feeling, faces cracked and bled from the wind. Frostbite was a constant danger, creeping silently in the darkest hours. The few scraps of fur and wool served as poor defense. Each hour was a battle against numbness, hypothermia, and the slow slipping away of life. Meanwhile, hunger gnawed relentlessly. The promise of landfall and plunder was a distant hope. But until then, men chewed on dried fish and rye bread hardened like stone. Those who caught fresh fish or seabirds provided crucial relief. The salt used to preserve meat was a double-edged sword. It kept food edible longer, but also increased thirst. Eating was a misery in itself. Digestion was slow, the body a battlefield of pain and weakness. Malnutrition weakened muscles, dulled senses, sapped will. Sanitation was virtually non-existent. Waste was cast directly into the sea when possible, but on long voyages the ship became a breeding ground for fleas, lice and disease. Individuals dealt with bodily functions in the few corners of the ship left unoccupied. Privacy was non-existent. The stench was suffocating. Morale sank with every scourge of lice and stomach upset. Survival here was a test of endurance beyond mere physical strength. The relationship with the sea was complex. It offered fish and passage, yet turned swiftly into a tyrannical god. Vikings prayed to gods like Njord and Aegir for favor and safe journey. But superstition could not change the brutal facts. The sea gave no quarter. Each day alive on those waves was a defiance of fate. The men aboard steel-edged their minds with rituals and grim humor to keep fear at bay, yet beneath the bravado lurked an awareness of their smallness, their fragility. Noise was constant. The creak of oars in metal rings, the slap of water against hull, the beating of sails and flutter of ropes, the shout of orders and grunts of exertion, the sounds of suffering, cries of the wounded or sick. No silence existed except the brief calm before a storm's fury. Sleep was drowned in this ceaseless chorus, making rest a thin, precious thread. The monotony of life aboard was a roaring cacophony of sound and sensation. Space was so limited that the men barely moved freely. Every inch of deck was crowded with weapons, supplies, and wet clothing. There was no room to stretch or unwind. Privacy was a forgotten concept. Bodies swayed together on the rolling deck, soaking in the endless damp and grime. Even the air was thick with the smell of damp wood, sweat, and unwashed flesh. There was no escape from the physical closeness and the psychological weight of it. The crew's mental state was a fragile thing. Long voyages bred superstition, fear, and a deep yearning for land. Some fell into despair. Others hardened beyond reason, their eyes hollow from long nights and endless daylight. Arguments broke the fragile truce held by shared hardship. Mutiny was a shadow always near. Yet discipline, tradition, and the lure of glory kept men working through the worst conditions. Respect for leadership and the promise of fame beyond death spurred them forward. Finally, the arrival at land was both relief and new challenge. But the question remains, would you last a day on a Viking ship? Could you endure the bone-chilling cold, the relentless hunger, the merciless sea? Could you bear the crushing exhaustion, the cramped, fettered quarters, the constant threat of disease and death? The answer is clear. For most, the answer is no. The Viking ship was a crucible forged by nature and necessity. Only the strongest, most determined, and most desperate survived to see shore again. Every moment on board was a trial by wind, water, and will. Life aboard a Viking ship was far removed from the romantic tales of conquest and adventure. It was raw, brutal, and unforgiving. The ocean was no mere backdrop, but an adversary in a fight that tested every fibre of body and soul. And the unforgiving truth remains. Few would last even a single day in the grip of those northern waters. The Viking ship was not a home or a sanctuary. It was a cage of survival, a place where comfort was a forgotten dream and death a constant companion. In the end, the saga of the Viking ship is a story of endurance, of men pushed to their limits by nature and necessity. It is a story of human beings stripped down to their primal instincts, fighting to live and to seize what little glory they could. Behind the myth and legend lies the harsh reality. To face a day on a Viking ship was to face a trial few could withstand. It was a crucible in which only the hardest were tempered. And for the rest, it was a place to perish, swallowed by the eternal sea. The sun had begun to sink low on the horizon, casting a muted gold across the restless sea. The longship, carved from ancient oak, sliced through the choppy waves with relentless determination. On board, the men faced a reality that was as unforgiving as the ocean itself. This was a world without mercy, a world where comfort was stranger than hardship. To live aboard a Viking ship was not a matter of endurance alone, but of understanding the unyielding and primal law of survival. The air hung heavy with the scent of salt and sweat, mingling with faint traces of smoke from a hearth where a meagre fire struggled to stay alive. There was no permanent shelter beneath the single square sail, and the open deck was the climber's only option. When night fell, the wind seemed to howl like a living beast through the rigging, tugging at the canvas that cracked and groaned above. There were no walls to hold back the chill, no soft beds to crawl into, only hard planks and the bruising cold of the northern waters. The men were soaked through from hours of relentless waves crashing over the bow. Their tunics and woolen cloaks felt heavy from sea spray and rain. Each breath produced mist in the frigid air. Skin chapped and raw, muscles tightened and cramped from the ceaseless labor of rowing. The oars were heavy and clumsy as the ship surged over the swells. The rhythm of rowing was taxing beyond imagination. There was no respite. Relentless work alternating with fearful bouts of waiting and watching. Beyond physical pain, there was an unending mental battle. Anxiety gnawed at every soul on board. The ocean seemed an endless void where one misstep or moment of distraction could mean death. The men were ever vigilant. The voice of the helmsman cut through the noise. Commands had to be obeyed instantly. A single error on a ship so narrow and exposed could send a man crashing into the sea. The cold water of the North Atlantic was a graveyard. Survival odds in those freezing depths were nearly zero. Exposure was a constant threat. The Vikings were hardy by necessity, but even the toughest bodies began to break down. The lack of fresh water was punishing, and rationing was cruel. Salted meat or dried fish were the only sustenance, and hunger gnawed relentlessly. Storms raged with terrifying ferocity. Blinding rain clumped feathers and hair into weighed-down mats. Lightning sliced through clouds, illuminating the crew's grim faces. Waves towered like mountains, the ship pitching violently from side to side. To stay upright and hold fast to the rigging during these moments taxed muscles and spirit beyond endurance. Illness was a silent, slow killer aboard. Wounds left untreated could fester and turn deadly. Seasickness was common and brutal. Even the strongest fell victim to nausea and despair. The harsh lifestyle permitted no room for weakness. Disease spread quickly in cramped conditions with little hygiene. The close quarters bred foul smells and discomfort. Sleep was scarce and fragmented. Rest came in stolen moments during brief lulls when the sea appeared tame. The ship's wooden planks creaked and moaned under the weight of men and cargo. Every creak was a reminder of vulnerability. There was no armor against smashed ribs or broken limbs if the ship crashed against hidden rocks. The very structure could betray them. The constant tug of the sea, combined with the centuries-old craftsmanship, left little room for error. The longship was fast and sleek but fragile. It was always a race against nature's unpredictable will. There was camaraderie aboard that forged a tight bond between men, but it was tempered with brutal realism. Personal space was non-existent. Privacy, a forgotten concept. There was no room for weakness or complaint. The hierarchy was clear and absolute. The captain's word was final on every matter. The strongest thrived. The weak were left to vulnerability. Panic or disobedience could spell doom for the entire crew. The psychological grip of such intense pressure was suffocating. Resilience was more than physical strength. It required an iron mind capable of embracing the harshest elements of existence. At times the sea appeared benign, teasing with smooth glass surfaces and gentle swells. Yet this illusion was dangerous. The Vikings knew better than to trust calm waters. Silence before a storm was a harbinger of catastrophe. Fear wrapped itself around every heartbeat. The rhythm of survival was dictated by nature's whims and man's strength. The sailors were linked by shared suffering and an understanding that death was never far. Each sunrise was a victory, each day aboard a battle against relentless hardship. The long hours in the open air had an abrasive effect. Skin burned by wind and sun, eyes stung from salt spray and grit. Every task was complicated by the ship's movement and exposure. Handling the rigging or prepping weapons required steady hands despite the cold and exhaustion. The weight of chainmail and shields added to the burden. Armour was a necessity for battle, but was impractical during travel. Yet the threat of attack ceased never. Raiders or rival clans could emerge from hidden coves without warning. The readiness demanded a constant state of alertness. Food was a meagre matter and never guaranteed. Salted fish and hard bread provided minimal sustenance. Fresh food was a luxury. Spoiled rations could lead to illness. Water had to be rationed carefully. In warmer months, rainwater was collected, but often it was insufficient. Dehydration combined with exhaustion was a thorough enemy. The men often dreamed of the lush meadows they had left behind. At sea, the horizon was a vast expanse of grey and blue devoid of comfort. The lonesome cry of seabirds was the only reminder of life beyond the endless waves. Sleeping meant curling in tight clusters on wood or thin mats. Protection from the wind was minimal. Each man took turns keeping watch. There was no escape from the cold night air. The sound of water lapping against the hull was constant and hypnotic. The threat of enemy approach meant sleep was never free from paranoia. Dreams were troubled by faces etched in fear and the knowledge of what could lie ahead. The very construction of the longship was a marvel of engineering, but also a symbol of its perilous nature. It depended on the skill of its crew and the favour of the elements. Unlike modern vessels, there were no compartments or bulkheads to prevent sinking. A single breach could doom the entire crew. The wood sometimes creaked and groaned under the strain, betraying the limits of its endurance. The craftsmanship was an art, but the ocean showed no mercy for imperfection. The physicality of controlling a Viking ship was unparalleled. Rowing demanded a level of coordination and stamina that few could maintain beyond a day. Men worked in rotations, but even the strongest felt the crushing ache after hours of relentless effort. Tears mixed with sweat as salt stung wounds and scrapes. Strength had to be preserved for forthcoming battles on shore or at sea. The energy expended left little room for error or hesitation. The elements were perhaps the greatest adversaries. Winds shifted without warning, currents pulled unpredictably, and storms could erupt in moments. Navigating by sun and stars required skill and knowledge that were hard-earned. Losing track of direction on featureless seas was easy and could be fatal. The frustration of wasted effort and the looming threat of running aground was ever present. Injuries were a harsh reality. Blisters from rowing and rope burns were common afflictions. Bruises and sprains were treated alongside the routine demands of survival. There was no medical comfort or specialized care. Healing was slow and precarious. Infection lurked behind every wound. Survivors relied on herbal remedies, but often these were scarce. The coping mechanism was grim acceptance. Weakness was a liability not often tolerated. Daily life was dictated by the sun and the caprices of the sea. There was little structure beyond the necessity of survival tasks. Yet, discipline was strict. Obedience to orders kept chaos at bay and ensured the longship was ready to strike or flee at a moment's notice. The balance between harshness and order was a vital survival measure. It was a delicate web where any misstep risked collapse. The sense of time lost meaning. The endless expanse of sky and sea blurred the line between days and nights. Fatigue smeared the senses. The men lived moment to moment, driven by commands and their own determination to endure. The pressure mounted with every hour. To last only one day aboard such a vessel was a challenge most would fail. Many would find themselves overwhelmed by the brutal reality of Viking life at sea. What awaited on shore was no less daunting. The promise of battle or pillage came with its own set of brutal challenges. Yet the voyage itself was an unyielding trial that tested the limits of human endurance. It was a place where nature and man collided with unstoppable force. Living aboard a Viking ship demanded strength, skill, and a mind tuned to the rhythms of the ocean's fury. This was a theatre of survival only the toughest could endure for a single day, let alone a lifetime. As darkness deepened, so too did the resolve among the crew. The knowledge that dawn would bring another day of struggle was a reminder that the harshness was far from over. The ship, though small against the vastness of the sea, was a floating crucible where only the strongest could persist. To step aboard was to embrace a world where every moment was a fight against the unforgiving elements and the frailty of the human body. In this relentless world, to last a day was itself a measure of greatness. Few could boast such endurance, and those who did carried the hard-earned respect of their kin. The Viking ship was more than a vessel. It was a trial by fire and water, a testament to the brutal reality of a world long vanished, but forever etched in the saga of human survival. Life aboard a Viking ship was a relentless battle against discomfort, danger, and the elements wholly indifferent to human endurance. Even before the sails caught the wind, the crew faced an existence that would wipe away the modern notions of space, cleanliness, and bodily privacy. The sheer physical constraints of the longship's design meant every man was packed tightly side by side, row upon row of oarsmen sharing cramped benches with barely an inch to spare between them. That close contact carried more than just the weight of bodies it carried. Disease, grime, and the ceaseless challenge of maintaining morale amid ceaseless fatigue. Imagine the beginning of a voyage. The men would gather before dawn, already chilled from a night exposed to the biting northern air or the wet sogginess of the shore. Their clothes were heavy, often made from thick wool or leather, still damp from sweat or previous rains. The oak timbers of the hull exuded a damp mustiness that clung to the air. There was no cabin or private quarters, only an open deck with a low railing and a single mast in the centre. Rowing was the primary method of propulsion when the wind faltered. This meant a constant, grueling push of muscle, arms locked with those of others, pulling wooden oars in unison. From dawn until the officer shouted orders to rest or adjust sails, the rowers had to stay precise and strong. The fatigue was relentless. The physical strain alone would demoralize many. But the environment was far worse. The scent aboard the Viking ship told stories of hardship. Sweat mixed with the musk of human bodies packed tightly. Sea salt mingled with the sharp tang of fish and salted meat, staples that sustained the crew but did little for flavor or digestion. Urine and vomit occasionally stained the deck from sickness or exhaustion. Rats and vermin lurked in the shadows beneath seats and in the barrels, gnawing on scraps and transmitting disease. With the whole crew close together, the chance of contagion rising with each coughing fit or foul wound was enormous. No one cried over cleanliness. Bathing was a luxury left for when they returned to land. The men wore layers of filthy clothing, sometimes for days. Lice were a constant irritation. Their itching alone could drive a man to near madness. When the longships stopped, bathing in cold water was the only relief, yet the cold itself was brutal. During winter, the exposure could bring hypothermia. Frostbite fingers and toes were a true danger on prolonged expeditions. Even in summer months, the sea breeze carried a slimy chill that soaked into bones through wet fabric and damp wood. Food was another relentless challenge. The Vikings brought salted meat and dried fish to keep them alive. Fresh food was rare and usually meant a hurried raid or landing on shore. The diet was incredibly monotonous, rarely nourishing, and often left the crew weak and susceptible to scurvy and other deficiencies. Water was stored in barrels but often tasted foul after days at sea. Rotten or spoiled food was a constant threat. Illness from poor diet and contaminated supplies could spread quickly. Hunger gnawed persistently, yet feasting was only for victorious returns. During voyages, the crew existed on meagre portions divided strictly to maintain order and ration what little there was. Sleep was a rare commodity and dangerous to indulge in too deeply. The Viking ship's deck pitched and rolled, pitching the body outside of the natural rhythm needed for restful rest. Sleep could come in brief naps, curled wherever a space opened, a shore stop, a sheltered bay, or huddled under a tarpaulin if the weather allowed. The cold, the noise of the creaking wooden mast, and the constant vigilance against threats meant that even those short rests came at a cost. A watchful captain or berserker stayed awake, looking for enemy ships or changes in weather, knowing a surprise attack or sudden storm could mean death. Storms were a particular terror. A Viking ship was lightweight and fast, but fragile compared to modern vessels. High winds tossed the ship with terrifying force, slanting oarsmen into each other and threatening to break the delicate wooden framework. Waves crashed over the deck, drenching the crew in icy seawater. Lightning shook the sky as the ship battled against nature's fury. In these moments, physical might was vital, but so was mental fortitude. Panic meant chaos, and chaos meant capsizing or death on the open sea. These storms claimed many lives silently, their bodies lost beneath unforgiving waves. One might imagine companionship and the spirit of brotherhood eased these hardships, and there is truth in that. The bonds forged in shared struggle were essential in keeping crews functioning. Yet even camaraderie had limits. Close quarters bred constant friction. Arguments simmered quickly in such tight confines. The stress of such an existence sharpened words to weapons. Punishments for insubordination or cowardice were harsh, sometimes fatal. Discipline was maintained through threat and example, ensuring the ship moved as one or faced oblivion. Beyond the physical and mental trials, the isolation was profound. The horizon so often was an unbroken line of water and sky, the sunsets distant and unreachable. The repetitive sound of waves slapping the hull and oars slicing the water merged into an oppressive cadence. Days blurred. Time lost meaning. Men could count only on the meals rationed, the orders barked, and their own endurance. Few aboard a Viking ship could leave their grim reality behind through hope or distraction. This was life stripped to its rawest form, existence defined by the next breath, the next pull on an oar, and the next moment survived. Longships carried the Vikings far and wide across the coasts of Europe, into rivers, sounds, and far-off islands. Despite their reputation for speed and agility, they were not vessels designed for comfort or safety. The price of voyaging on these ships was steep and often paid with health, sanity, or life itself. One day aboard such a ship was enough to break the strongest men. It was a world where the faint of heart dissolved into ocean spray or the cold grip of night. The sea demanded everything and gave back little. To last even one day on a Viking ship required physical power, mental toughness, and an iron will sharpened like the blade of a warrior. Without these qualities, survival became an impossible wager. This harsh existence laid the foundation for the Viking legacy, carved not in luxury or ease, but in sweat, salt, and steel. Behind the myths and the tales of glorious raids lies the unvarnished truth of this brutal life at sea. The Viking ship was more than a vessel. It was a crucible. It stripped men to their core and tested the limits of human endurance. It revealed the thin line between survival and doom. The men who sailed these ships were remarkable only because they embraced this hardship, day after day, storm after storm, journey after journey. For the rest, those who dreamed of glory but faltered at the first snap of a freezing wind or the first strain of aching muscle would find the sea unforgiving, the ship unyielding, and the voyage over before it barely began. The next time you see a Viking ship gliding across the waves in a history book or a movie, remember the many souls who never lasted a day aboard those wooden beasts. Their story is not one of comfort or ease, but of staggering endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a reminder that Viking voyages were not mere adventures, but epic tests of survival against an indifferent sea and a brutal world. The sun climbs higher, teasing the horizon in shades of fiery amber and molten gold. The Viking ship cuts through restless waves, each man's breath a mist mixing with the salty spray. The sky is an unrelenting expanse, and the sea's tantrums are many. To be aboard such a vessel was to engage in a battle not just with enemies on distant shores, but with the elements themselves. The challenge was ceaseless and unforgiving. Life on a Viking ship was a relentless test of endurance and spirit. Imagine waking before dawn, eyes blurred by sleep stolen, the wooden deck cold and damp beneath bare feet. The air was thick with the odor of brine, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of rusting iron. Every muscle ached from the heavy labor demanded by the voyage, demanding strength that most would find unimaginable. The ship itself, a masterpiece of craftsmanship and brutal practicality, was no sanctuary. Its narrow confines pressed upon those aboard like the grasp of an unseen predator. The longship's planks creaked and groaned in protest under the strain of waves and wind. Each time the hull dove into a trough or surged atop a crest, the entire vessel shivered, sending vibrations that raced through every bone and sinew. There was no soft bed nestled away from the ordeal. Rest came where one could find it on a hard, splintered plank or wedged awkwardly between the curved ribs of the ship. Sleep was a fleeting refuge. It invited exposure to the cold night and the ever-present risk of being hurled against the sharp edges of the boat by an unexpected wave. The elements showed no mercy. The sea breathed a fiery rage during storms that swept the skies with jagged bolts of lightning and whipped the deck with torrents of rain. For hours the men battled wind and water, gripping ropes slick with salt and sweat, muscles trembling from exhaustion but refusing to yield. The cold was a persistent adversary. Even in summer months, the North Atlantic's chill seeped into every crevice. Hands swollen and cracked from relentless exposure, noses runny, teeth chattering beneath layers of crude but practical clothing. The ship offered no shield from the shivering grasp of the night. To succumb to cold was to risk fatal hypothermia, yet it was impossible to fully protect oneself while aboard. Yet the sheer physical strain was only part of the torment. The stench of the ship was a constant assault. The shared breath of dozens of men mingled with the scent of unwashed bodies and the pervasive smell of fish and salt. The storage hold, packed tight with provisions intended to sustain the crew for weeks or months, was a haven for rot and decay. Fish guts, dried meat strips, hard biscuits made from densely baked barley flour carried the risk of mold and infestation. Rats were relentless guests, scurrying through hidden pockets, nibbling at supplies, and spreading disease with their filthy presence. Vermin bites and the stings of insects added fresh misery to an already overwhelming sense of discomfort. Hygiene was a fleeting thought, pushed far from the minds of those who had tasks pressing on. Water was precious but scarce. Freshwater supplies had to be carefully rationed, kept in barrels that the salt air threatened to spoil daily. The taste was often foul, carrying a brackish undertone that challenged the will to drink. When thirst clawed at the throat, every swallow was gratitude spiked with regret. The skin peeled and cracked from salt exposure, and small cuts from handling rough ropes or ship fixtures frequently became infected in such harsh conditions. Meals were ruthlessly simple. Sustenance was functional and minimal. Dried fish, hard-tack biscuits, salted meats were eaten by hands worn raw from work. Flour mixed into a basic porridge was a rare comfort, but often there was no time to sit. Food was consumed in swift, practical bites to fuel the demands of rowing, navigating, or combat preparation. With so much focus on survival, there was no room for indulgence or pleasure in eating. Even social tension gnawed at the edges of sanity. The close quarters amplified irritations, disputes, and the weight of homesickness. Arguments over navigation or division of spoils could flare into violence. The pride and honor of Viking warriors often found expression in heated words or flashes of fury, barely held in check by comradeship and the shared need to survive as a group. Sleep deprivation frayed the mind, and the endless routine of labor and vigilance left little hope for escape from the crushing stress. The physical dangers extended far beyond the storm. The ship rode on precarious wooden ribs. Shattered mast or torn sail could turn a hopeful journey into a desperate fight for survival. Crew members risked falling overboard, swallowed by cold, merciless waters that offered no quarter. Injuries from oar accidents, slipping on wet decks, or clashing weapons were frequent. Medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. Infections could turn minor wounds into death sentences. Navigational challenges were another layer of hardship. Without modern tools, Vikings relied on keen observation of sun, stars, sea currents, bird flight, and even the taste and color of water. Misreading any of these signs could mean drifting off course, trapped in hostile waters, or stranded on inhospitable shores. The tension of constant alertness was draining, because a single error could doom the entire crew. The mental burdens were as weighty as the physical. Isolation from family and homeland fostered a gnawing sense of displacement. On long voyages, the mind wrestled with fears of the unknown. Anxiety and superstition took root in the dark hours. Belief in gods and spirits was woven into daily life, providing some measure of hope, but also magnifying the terror of storms and unexplained phenomena. The sea itself was a vast, unknowable force that humbled even the bravest. One must also wrestle with the sheer monotony punctuated by bursts of deadly violence. Raid targets were often villages or monasteries, places where women, children, and the elderly lived. When the moment for attack came, the fight was savage and brutal. The crack of axe on wood and bone, the cries of both warriors and victims, the chaos of fire and blood were all part of the Viking experience. Yet this violence was only an occasional flare amid the daily grind of rowing, sailing, repairing, and enduring hardship. Each day spent aboard was an exhausting negotiation with the natural world. The ship was a fragile ecosystem where the health and sanity of the crew were constantly at risk. One had to be strong, adaptable, and fiercely determined simply to last the journey. To say that you would not last a day is no exaggeration. The physical, mental, and emotional demands were staggeringly high. The Viking longship was a crucible that forged warriors, but also shattered many who dared to step upon her planks unprepared. The history of Viking voyages is written with the stories of those who survived against staggering odds, but also the silent tales of those lost to the sea, the sickness, and the brutal realities of being at the edge of the world in a fragile wooden boat. To truly grasp why you would not last a day on such a ship is to understand that Viking exploration and conquest was a supreme feat of human endurance and spirit. The Viking ship was more than a vessel. It was a moving world of hardship, courage, and unyielding will. and every traveller who dared to cross its threshold stepped into a realm where only the strongest, most relentless souls survived. The next time you picture Vikings sailing the northern seas, think beyond the helmets and shields. Imagine the weary faces, raw hands, and frozen nights. Consider the countless hours spent battling hunger, cold, exhaustion, and fear. Endurance was the currency of survival. It was this unshakable toughness that made Viking voyages possible. Without it, the dream of reaching unknown lands, raiding faraway coasts, and forging legends would dissolve beneath the waves. In the vast shadow of those mighty longships, human fragility met iron resolve. The decades of Viking exploration and settlement were tinged with hardships so raw and immediate that modern comforts seem almost unimaginable. The reality was stark. To set foot on a Viking ship was to embrace a relentless trial by water and wind, sweat and blood. It was not a voyage for the faint-hearted or those clinging to softness. To survive even a single day required a warrior's heart and a soul tempered by the harshest storm. So as the waves continue to rise and fall, the wind howls across the sea, and the ship creaks beneath the strain, remember this. The Viking longship was a world of challenge and danger, where every moment was a fight to live, to breathe, to keep the relentless sea from claiming another lost soul. You would not last a day. Not because the Vikings did not want you there, but because their world was built upon a foundation so demanding that only the fiercest could claim their place amidst the roaring tide. The unrelenting dampness on a Viking ship is unlike anything experienced on solid ground. From the moment you step aboard, the cold sea air seeps into your bones, wrapping around you like a second skin chilled to the point of discomfort. The wooden planks beneath your feet are perpetually soaked with seawater, splashed over by crashing waves and driven into every crack by the relentless spray. The longships are built for speed and agility, not comfort. There is no insulation to protect you from the biting wind or the drizzle that seems to come from all directions at once. You are constantly wet. Your clothes cling to your skin, heavy and sodden. There is no reprieve from the clammy chill. Breathing is another battle entirely. The air on deck is a mixture of salty ocean spray, smoke from the occasional cooking fire, and the pervasive stench of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the inevitable refuse generated by dozens of men living in such close quarters. The wafting scent of fish and fermented ale linger, mingling with the less savoury odours of human waste. The smell is so persistent it numbs your nose. One must learn to shut it out or risk being overwhelmed by nausea. Fresh air does not exist on these journeys. The sickly odour clings relentlessly to your skin, your clothes, your hair. It is inescapable. The Viking ship itself is a fragile cocoon thrown into chaos with each swell of the sea. Storms are a constant hazard. The ships ride atop the waves like a leaf in a tempest, tossing their human cargo mercilessly from side to side. The sea spray is cold enough to cut like a whip. Rain combines with the salt to gnaw at exposed skin. Exposure is not just a discomfort, it is a threat to survival. Hypothermia creeps up on even the strongest warrior. The sheer physical toll of enduring this harsh environment is staggering. Every muscle is tense, every joint aching from hours spent battling to keep balance on the slippery deck. Every breath draws in the bitter sea air that chills and dulls the mind. Sleep is a precious and elusive commodity. With the creaking of timbers, the groaning of the mast, and the constant slap of water alongside the hull, rest is broken and seldom deep. During storms, it is often impossible to lie down at all. Men must be ready to spring into action to adjust the sails, bail water, or man the oars at a moment's notice. There is never complete stillness. The yawning sky above, often blanketed by dark clouds, offers no comfort. When the night is clear, the cold intensifies as the temperature plunges without the sun's warmth. Sleeping on the soaked wooden planks without bedding does little to protect the body. Speaking of oars, the rowing itself is torture. Long shifts of low position, heavy labor test endurance beyond usual human limits. For much of the journey, the ship depends on human power to propel it forward. The oarsmen sit shoulder to shoulder, bending and pulling in unison to forge ahead against wind and tide. Each stroke is physically exhausting. The rhythm of strokes is relentless, broken only by brief moments of respite, during which your muscles scream for rest that never fully comes. Blisters form quickly on raw hands that grip cold, wet wood. The salt water seeps into every wound, making healing impossible. Cramping sets in as exhaustion collides with pain. The toll of this labor can leave even the strongest Viking unable to stand at the end of the day. The danger of the sea is not limited to weather alone. The vastness of open water harbors unseen threats. Sudden squalls can appear without warning, turning the waves white and furious. A wrong move or an unlucky roll of the ship sends men tumbling into cold depths. Drowning was a frequent and feared end for those aboard. The chill of the North Atlantic leaves hypothermal conditions setting in almost immediately. Few could swim in the heavy gear and heavier fear. The clang of unseen rocks below threatened the wooden hull with destruction. Stranded miles from land, a ship in distress meant death was often the only certainty. Food aboard the Viking ship was sparse and unvaried. Provisions consisted primarily of hard-dried meats, salty fish, coarse bread, and dried fruits when available. Fresh food was a rarity. Preservation techniques centered mostly on smoking, salting, or drying. The flavor was harsh and the textures rough. Meals were eaten quickly between the duties of sailing, often cold or barely warmed over a meagre fire. Water was carried in barrels but could become brackish after prolonged travel. Drinking was an ongoing challenge. A shortage of fresh water meant that thirst often gnawed alongside hunger. Dehydration added yet another layer of suffering for the men on board. Hygiene was nearly non-existent. With no facilities or fresh water for washing, grime built up rapidly on skin and clothing. Clothing was typically made from wool, which, when wet, becomes heavy and itchy. Bedbugs and lice were persistent tormentors. This constant presence of vermin added irritation and introduced a risk of disease. The cramped conditions, combined with exposure to the elements and poor diet, undermined the bodies of those aboard, leaving them vulnerable to illness. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a real threat on longer voyages and could result in weakness, bleeding gums, and eventually death if not treated. The mental strain of the voyage was as critical as the physical hardships. Isolation on the endless sea eroded morale. Cramped spaces offered no privacy, no escape from the sight of suffering or the stench of sickness. Men were forced to confront their fears and frustrations in close proximity. The long journey was filled with uncertainty. Fear of attack by hostile forces was constant. The unpredictability of the weather and the challenges of navigation left every sailor at the mercy of fate. This pressure sometimes led to tension and conflict among the crew. Loyalty and camaraderie were essential, but not always sufficient to maintain order. Consider also the ship's structure itself. Built of overlapping planks carefully sealed with tar and animal hair, the hull was a masterpiece of craftsmanship designed for speed and flexibility. Yet it offered little protection from the elements. The deck was open to the sky, leaving men exposed to wind, rain, and the occasional splatter of fish guts as they were gutted and prepared. The mast and sail, a huge woolen canvas soaked from the ocean spray, was a constant hazard during storms. The rigging ropes, thick and rugged, posed entanglement risks. Moving swiftly about the ship required constant vigilance and a stubborn-footed grip. In the heart of this mobile steel cage were the warriors themselves, fierce, rugged men hardened by years of battle and hardship. Even for them, a day at sea could feel like an ordeal that tested every limit of human endurance. Vikings were known for their resilience, but that resilience did not erase the brutal reality of life aboard a ship cut adrift on unpredictable waters. Every second was a contest against the forces of nature and fatigue, discomfort and danger. The constant fatigue, the brittle cold, the smell and the noise, the hunger and thirst proved a daunting crucible. It forged a spirit as sharp as the blades those men carried, but came at an incredibly high personal cost. The ancient texts and sagas speak of heroic voyages and daring raids. They speak of glory won and feared enemies defeated. What they often leave unsaid is how savage and dangerous life was once you stepped onto those narrow planks. The truth is that most men would not last a day on a Viking ship without succumbing to the unforgiving reality of life at sea. Imagine standing on that slippery deck with the raging sea all around. Your muscles scream in protest, your skin prickles with cold. The unending spray stings your eyes. The wind howls in your ears, carrying the clash of waves and ropes. Your clothes are soaked through. Your hands are raw and bleeding. Hunger gnaws relentlessly at your belly. All this while knowing that the next wave might be the one that sends you overboard. This was the Viking life in its unvarnished form. Not a romantic adventure, but a brutal struggle to survive. Yet the Vikings thrived despite these conditions. Their ships were marvels of engineering, their crews skilled seamen and fearless warriors. This relentless battle against the elements and exhaustion shaped the very heart of their culture. It demanded toughness, endurance, and a fierce will to survive. The hardships carved heroes and forged legends. But beneath every saga was a man fighting to hold on in a world where even a single day at sea could mean the end. Looking beyond the immediate physical challenges, one sees how this way of life molded the Viking psyche. The harshness of the sea voyage created a kind of unity among the crew, a bond born of shared suffering. Every man depended on the other to pull through. There was no room for weakness or hesitation. Trust and discipline were vital, because a careless mistake might doom them all. Despite the conditions, there was an unspoken honor and pride in enduring the sea's wrath. It was a test of courage, stamina, and loyalty. However, the psychological toll often went unspoken. Extended exposure to these unforgiving elements could sap a man's spirit. Loneliness, homesickness, and fear pressed in despite the collective strength and noisy camaraderie. Men wrestled quietly with their doubts while outwardly maintaining the stoic veneer expected of Viking warriors. Nights in particular could be haunting. The vast black sea stretching out endlessly beneath a cold sky dissolved any sense of security. The howls of the wind through rigging seemed almost like voices of the lost. For some, the ever-present threat of death became an obsession. In addition to weather, hunger, and illness, constant vigilance against pirates and enemies was required. The Vikings were not merely passive voyagers, they were raiders always ready to strike or defend. The deck was a battleground in waiting, weapons close to hand. The need to stay alert, often on little sleep and weak from malnutrition, was a deadly challenge. The clash of steel, the crack of arrows, and the roar of battle could replace the sounds of the sea in an instant. A sudden attack demanded instantaneous action. Failure was fatal. Despite all these terrors and trials, lasting even a single day aboard a Viking ship was a testament to human endurance rarely rivaled in history. These vessels were the cutting edge of Viking power, transporting warriors who reshaped the maps of northern Europe. The hardships endured accelerated their legend, but none should underestimate the brutal cost endured silently on those waves. Few today would honestly survive the physical, mental, and emotional toll of the Viking maritime ordeal for even one full day. The stories and sagas stand on a foundation of real human suffering and remarkable endurance. To exist aboard a longship was to live in constant combat with every element that nature and circumstance could throw against you. The sea was equal parts highway and hunter. The ship was a fragile beast, creaking under the weight of humanity and hardship. Survival was contingent on grit, skill, and relentless willpower. The bitter taste of salt spray and sweat, the endless cold gnawing at flesh, The growing exhaustion and despair, these defined life on the waves. No amount of courage could fully erase the savage difficulty of a day at sea with the Vikings. If the very first daylight hour seemed daunting, keep in mind that this was not a brief test. Many voyages stretched for weeks or months without safe harbor. The constant repetition of fatigue, hunger, and exposure built up relentlessly. A man would find himself swallowed by the elements, not once, but repeatedly. The idea of rest was often a cruel illusion. Every task threatened to exhaust, and every night brought new terror. Even the strongest would question their ability to endure such hardship. Viking ships were often wild beasts of the sea, unyielding and merciless. One cannot speak of surviving a day on a Viking ship without acknowledging the cold itself as an enemy. The North Atlantic and the Baltic are known for their brutal chill. Frozen seawater sprays pummel exposed skin until feeling fades and numbness creeps upward. Sustained exposure reduces the body's ability to regulate temperature. The cold seeps through wool garments into sinew and bone. Beyond physical discomfort, the chilling effect clouds the mind, dulling reflexes and judgment. These are conditions where even a momentary lapse can tip the balance toward disaster. Hypothermia crept slowly and invisibly, devouring strength and willpower. Battling the cold was made even more difficult by the wet conditions. Waterlogged clothing stiffened and froze when temperatures dipped below freezing at night. Constant waves splashing on the deck ensured men could not stay dry even if they wanted to. The salt-laden spray left a thin film of ice in any moments of calm or on cold mornings. Hands and feet turned blue and stiff. Numb fingers struggled to grasp ropes and weapons securely. The cold was a merciless adversary, relentless in pursuit. The mental perseverance required to maintain composure in these conditions was remarkable, but not infallible. Dozens of men crowded on a narrow beam of wood, pressed close against each other in grim determination. When one man's strength failed, it threatened all. Death was not a solitary event, but a communal crisis. Keeping morale alive was part of the survival battle. Tales of heroism and the promise of glory drove men forward, but these could not erase the raw terror and suffering that defined life at sea for the Viking crew. These mental pressures came with the inability to escape. Unlike battles fought on land, at sea there was no sanctuary. If a man became sick or injured, he remained exposed to the elements and the dangers of the ship. There were no hospitals or proper medical care aboard. Treatment was primitive and limited to rudimentary first aid, often administered by those with only passing knowledge of healing. Wounds could fester and infections spread rapidly in such surroundings. An untreated illness or injury was often a death sentence. The brutal, unforgiving conditions also extended to sleep. The cramped quarters below deck were typically reserved for women and non-combatants. Most warriors slept on open decks, exposed to the elements. The noise of the ship, constant motion, and the wet surface made rest fitful. The absence of bedding meant hardness pressed constantly against the body. The cold seeped relentlessly into bones. Men woke often, covered in sweat and shivering, sometimes even drenched by night waves splashing aboard. Unable to achieve restorative sleep, exhaustion accumulated dangerously. In addition to physical pain, the monotony of a Viking voyage could weigh heavily on the mind. Days blurred together in cyclical hardship. Every hour was a blend of relentless labour and moments of fearful anticipation. Mental fatigue rivaled the physical kind as the mind struggled to focus amid pain, discomfort, and the knowledge of the dangers ahead. The claustrophobic living conditions, combined with the endless ocean horizon, fostered a sense of isolation and helplessness. Only the closest bonds between men offered some barrier against despair. This harsh existence was ultimately what made Viking longships both feared and respected. Their crews were forged in crucibles of storms and struggles that few would willingly face. These warriors endured conditions that broke the bodies and spirits of lesser men. The unforgiving reality of a day on a Viking ship serves as a breathtaking testament to human endurance. The very elements that threatened to destroy them became the final proving ground, the harsh arena in which they forged their place in history. Ultimately, understanding why you would not last a day on a Viking ship means appreciating the full force of nature, humanity, and history converging in that small space of wooden sail. It is a story of endurance beyond imagining, of survival on the razor's edge. Every creak in the timber, every wave smashing against the planks, every cold gust that yanks at your clothing is a reminder that this was no gentle voyage. It was a fierce test, often deadly, that shaped destinies and legends alike. To set foot on a Viking ship was to dare the unimaginable, with only the strength of your will to hold you fast. The life aboard a Viking ship was brutal and relentless. From the moment the first light of dawn crept over the horizon until the stars claimed the sky, every hour tested the limits of human endurance. The constant motion of the sea, the biting cold, and the ever-present threat of storms kept every crew member on edge. There was no room to rest when the ship's survival depended on every pair of hands working in unison. Food was scarce and often unpleasant. Salted fish, hard biscuits, and whatever game could be caught shaped a diet that lacked variety and comfort. Fresh water was rationed carefully to ensure it lasted the entire voyage. Illness or injury were dangers in themselves, but in the cramped and unsanitary conditions of the ship, healing was a slow and unreliable process. The threat of infection or exposure was far more deadly than the enemies waiting on distant shores. Every crew member had a role, whether rowing tirelessly, maintaining the vessel, or standing watch for threats. Vikings were fearsome warriors on land, but at sea they were vulnerable to storms and exhaustion. The roar of crashing waves and howling wind could swallow cries for help. The bond between Vikings was forged in these shared hardships. It required unwavering trust and discipline to avoid disaster. The ship itself was a marvel of engineering, designed for speed and agility. But that did not make the journey any easier. Constantly wet and exposed to the elements, the crew had to endure cold bones and aching muscles. Sleep was fragmented and stolen between duties. Privacy and comfort were non-existent. Personal space was a concept lost to the endless expanse of ocean and the pressed-together bodies of the men who lived to sail and raid. To understand why you would not last a day on a Viking ship is to realize it was not a life for the faint of heart. It demanded bravery, resilience, and an iron constitution. The crew's survival hinged on their ability to adapt and persevere against every hardship nature and circumstance could throw at them. The sea was a tough teacher, and life aboard a Viking ship was its ultimate test. In the end, the Viking ship was more than a vessel. It was a home and a battlefield. It carried dreams of conquest and the harsh reality of survival. For those who dared to board it, the sea offered no second chances. To last a day on a Viking ship required every ounce of strength, courage, and endurance. Few ever truly succeeded, and that is why standing on those wooden planks in the middle of the roaring ocean was not something anyone unprepared would live to tell about. The life aboard a Viking ship was an experience unlike any other, a brutal trial where only the strongest and most resilient could endure. The biting cold would gnaw at your skin as the wind whipped through your hair and stung your face. Sleep was scarce and unsafe. You would be packed tightly with dozens of other men, ever vigilant against threat, whether from the unforgiving sea or hostile enemies. There was no shelter from the elements or respite from the relentless demands of rowing. Your body ached from the strain, muscles screaming for relief, yet the journey required relentless effort at every turn. The food you ate was simple and scarce. Hard biscuits, salted meat, and sometimes dried fish were your only sustenance. Fresh water was rationed carefully, and the constant salt spray made thirst an ever-present torment. Sickness spread quickly in such close quarters. Dysentery and infections were deadly dangers with no real medicine on board. The threat of combat loomed constantly. These ships were vessels of war and exploration, not comfort. When battles erupted, your survival depended on fierce courage and sharp instincts. The camaraderie among Vikings was powerful, forged through shared hardship and unyielding spirit. Yet even this brotherhood offered small comfort when the waves towered impossibly high or storms threatened to swallow the ship whole. Your senses would be stretched to the limit. The taste of salt on your lips, the sound of crashing waves, the sight of endless, unyielding grey sea. Such conditions tested the very essence of human endurance. By the end of a single day, you would be battered, exhausted, hungry and cold. Your mind would race with uncertainty and your body begged for rest. Few could withstand this relentless ordeal beyond the first sunlit hours. The Viking ship was not a place for mere mortals seeking comfort or ease. It was a crucible where only the toughest hearts and strongest bodies survived. This was why you would not last a day aboard a Viking ship. The unforgiving sea, the harsh elements, the constant toil, and the ever-present shadow of danger combined in a relentless challenge. A challenge that stripped away every trace of weakness until only the fierceness of the Viking spirit remained. This is the reality behind the legends, the truth that transformed ordinary men into legendary warriors of the sea.